expecting the hallway, and I'm in New York on the street, you know, and the door is gone, you know. So things don't always happen, but there is some action selection, that process that's happening, and there's something that's affecting, there's some kind of actuator or something that's changing the representation I have. How does that happen? So this is just a very interesting and puzzling question, and it kind of led to me to use this whole line of exploration to the idea of how can the idea of a mental state be conceived in LIDA? And so I've begun to think about this in the context not just of waking versus dreams, but in this context of the stressed emotional state versus the non-stressed state, and maybe the traumatic versus the non-traumatic functioning of memory. So just to kind of review with some looking at this, you know, we're talking about mental states and going back to this. This is the driver in the pileup while he was in the scanner. I think the increased activation in the amygdala, this very dark spot here in the lower right, is very understandable in terms of the alarm system, the smoke detector. The right visual cortex is interesting, especially coupled with a decreased activation in the thalamus. So there's an idea of sensory overload, and the memory is playing. I'm interpreting kind of in a van der Kolkian way. I'm interpreting here, and so this is very, bear with me, it's very quasi-empirical and kind of a stretch. But as the person is reliving the event, it's like going off in their brain like a movie. And the normal sequence of the thalamus kind of integrating that into a narrative of what's happening isn't taking place because the thalamus is kind of offline. And so this is kind of the sensory overload, or kind of the sense of overwhelming. You know, the other interesting thing is, okay, in the dorsal PFC, the timekeeper is shut down, that white area towards the front of the brain, which is at the top of the image. The other interesting thing, and he doesn't have an arrow here, but it's on the left side of the brain. You see the asymmetry in the activation. Broca's area is whited out here. The whole idea, he makes it very biological, the whole idea of speechless terror. You know? And literally, your ability to verbalize goes offline. It's like, you know, you can't put into words. So I think that's a motor aspect, but I think the dorsolateral PFC is also going to be involved in the kind of the rational processing that would help be necessary for that linguistic connection, and there may be some association between the dorsolateral PFC and the Broca's area. I think they may be pretty closely anatomically related, but I'd have to check that. All right, I'm on slide number 22, and I think I might have 32 to go, so I better kind of try to move it up a little bit here. So long-term memory differences in PTSD. There seems to be a difference in the way long-term memories are formed. There's a study called the Grant Study of Adult Development out of Harvard. In the early 40s, there were some 200 sophomores that graduated over several years, and then they were studied. They were interviewed at successive decades for like 50 years. And many of them, of course, they didn't know it when they began the study, but many of them went on to, you know, a few years after the study began, the U.S. entered World War II, and many of them were combat veterans. And the long-term memory difference is that the combat-related memories in the ones that acquired PTSD were much more stable over time. In other words, they told the same thing.
They didn't change.
That's right, over 50 years. Whereas the ones that were in combat but didn't have PTSD, they would tell the story one way 10 years after, and then 20 years after, there was a progression to where sometimes there was even contradictory accounts, between the two, but not in the PTSD. So notice I say more stable recall. Means it doesn't change. That doesn't necessarily prove that it's a more accurate memory.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, related to this is something that Sean told me about, and I did a little reading. It's something called flashbulb memories, and these are highly detailed and vivid memories under extreme emotional stress. Some of the early studies were interviews of people and their memories around JFK assassination or other news. But the idea is that I think there's a study I read that quoted James, an impression may be so exciting emotionally as to almost leave a scar upon the cerebral tissue. That's just a statement by James that summarizes the idea that
Scar being something would be very stable, it wouldn't change.
Yes. The idea is that the stronger my emotions are about an event, the deeper impression it's going to leave on my memory.
Right. And so in this case, emotional stress, it doesn't have to be negative necessarily. I mean, I don't have, children, but it's possible that somebody, on seeing their child being born might have some very vivid, flashbulb memory of that event.
I think so, and I think pleasure, pain and pleasure. One of the things that they do is in relation to intensity is they affect learning. Yeah. And if you have if you have absolute no pain, no pleasure, it becomes very difficult to learn.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to compare, in one case it becomes sort of pathological where, something is really going wrong because of that flashbulb memory or this vivid, memory. And there's other cases where it's not pathological, it's just something has modulated how we...
That's right. Yeah. There's a spectrum, and the phenomenon. There's a lot of research about it, and I'm just now starting to look at it. I actually ordered a volume called Flashbulb Memories by Martin Conway, who he's a reference for some of our early work, isn't he? Is it
I've forgotten.
Transient Episodic Memory, or no? Martin Conway, I think. Yeah.
It is transient episodic memory. That's exactly what it is.
He edits this volume in relation to flashbulb memories, and that's from like it starts. The research program started in like the 60s, and this volume is kind of compare the pros and cons and looking at it in the 80s, and then there's some people who have recently done some work. Yerkes Dodson was just like the beginning of the 20th century, and it's actually been, I read an interesting review that said it was ignored for the first 50 years of the 20th century, then it was misrepresented for the second 20th century. We've seen the what's called the curvilinear relationship between motivation and learning, which means if you're not motivated enough, then you're not going to learn. But if you're too motivated enough, you can fail to learn.
Yeah, sure.
Yerkes Dodson, that's not the whole story of Yerkes Dodson. Yerkes Dodson found that that's true with sufficiently difficult tasks, that you have that curvilinear relationship. If it's an easy enough task, you have a linear relationship. So if you have a simple task that you're motivating animals to learn with shock, so they can avoid the shock, the more you shock them, the faster they'll learn it.
It's linear.
Linear. But if you make the task difficult enough, then you get the curvilinear. Yes, and this is interesting. That little fact, I'm just now starting to explore it, but it's a high stress level in learning easy versus difficult tests. It's the effect of the stress on the learning, and it's different. How do you define easy versus difficult? It's probably a very interesting question, but yes, there's certainly a point at which the effect that stress has changes.
Well, it also depends on how many times the person is exposed to that task. So if the person has very high motivation, but he is constantly failing at that task, which by definition that means it's a difficult task, then they would not learn much more about it. Is that true?
Thank you for that segue, because I'm about to talk about learned helplessness, and I think that's very, very,
Okay.
very, very on task for that. Before I go on to that, though, the last piece of this in the flashbulb memories, and I'm just starting to review this paper, that long-term potentiation, which is a synaptic mechanism for learning, has different responses to stress in different areas. There are primitive areas in which high stress will increase long synaptic learning, and then there are less primitive areas like prefrontal cortex where it has the opposite effect. So this is kind of a neural level at which the mechanism, this is quite interesting. I've got more reading to do on that, but I just thought I'd report that little bit that I've picked up so far. Okay, so cognitive modeling challenges for LIDA researchers. So there's a different way that memory is formed under the exposure condition, and that's something to be modeled. Is how do we get these two different memory formations? How can we tell that story in terms of a multi-cycle sequence of LIDA cognitive cycles? Then we would have the sequence represented by the intrusive recall in flashback, where that exposure memory that got, I mean, well, in the non-pathological case, we would need to elaborate all of these aspects of how they occur in the normal case, and then compare that to a different mechanism that accounts for the intrusive recall and flashback. And so the attentional selection really gets, I think, hijacked by the intrusive. That's why it's intrusive. And then there's a dysphoria, meaning it feels like crap to have this experience. It does not feel good to relive that memory. So, you know, when they do the script-induced flashbacks for the scanner, you know, they have to get the patient's permission to do this, you know, and it's not pleasant. It's something that they have to choose to endure for the sake of science. Now, then there's the dissociation aspect that would need to be modeled. I'm going to try to move a little faster here. And then there's the avoidance behaviors. And then I'm not sure how much we would get into this, since it's mediated by the autonomic nervous system, but the state of hyperarousal, and it's characterized by excessive attention to ambiguous stimuli. There might be some ways of producing that behavior in an agent with a kind of a LIDA framework. But these are all open questions and challenges that this kind of idea of exploring PTSD with regards to LIDA, these are all areas for exploration. Okay, now it's 5:23. I'd like to finish by 5:30. I will begin to talk about learned helplessness, which is research in which dogs were exposed to inescapable shock. This is done in the 70s. It's not currently being done, at least not in this way. And these dogs are later unable to learn escape behaviors normally in escapable circumstances. The thing here is this exposure to an uncontrollable aversive event, and this is the link to PTSD. This is a much more constrained paradigm than kind of the clinical, clinical PTSD is so open-ended as to what things can cause it and so forth. This is a very constrained paradigm. It's easier to kind of model experimentally. And Seligman and Meyer, in a review article, which is very good, proposed that when events are uncontrollable, the organism learns that its behavior and outcomes are independent. And
Sorry, just a quick question. So
Yeah.
in terms of, for these experiments, how long did it take before this learned helplessness?
coming up.
Oh, it's coming up, okay.
In terms of our model, the agent is constantly, an autonomous agent constantly answers the question, what do I do next? That's what the mind does, is it answers that question. And in the context of learned helplessness, the answer becomes, who cares? It doesn't matter. It's not going to make any difference. So the search for a satisfactory
It
answer.
doesn't matter, but who cares if there are very different things, though.
Well, the result on the key thing that I'm pointing out is that the search for a satisfactory answer gets terminated.
Absolutely, yes.
Resources that would normally be allocated for finding a response just get taken offline. Now, this learned helplessness phenomenon generalizes to other species, including cats, fish, and humans. They didn't use shock with humans. Okay, they used annoying sounds and stuff like this. But
Didn't I read about this with mice and rats with rodents?
I don't know if you read about it. We've talked about it.
Okay.
Yeah. Now it's interesting with
You
rodents.
said many other species.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the helplessness, it turns out, is not a function of actual controllability. It's not a function of exposure to the adverse events, but is exposed to perceived uncontrollability. All right, so these experiments you were asking, Sean, I think this will answer your question. They had 3 groups. We're calling them naive, escape, and yoked. The naive group was just kept in a harness, didn't do anything with that group. The escape group were given a series of shocks, but they had a little button that they could touch with their nose, and they quickly learned that if they touched the button with their nose, it stopped the shock. And then the third group is called yoked. They were just shocked. They just had to sit there and take it. Now, after this exposure, they were placed in a different task, and this was called a shuttle box. It's actually enclosed, so they can't run off. But there is a grid that's going to be electrified, and then there's a barrier. If they hop over the barrier, then they will escape the shock. And the naive and the escape groups quickly learn to avoid the shock. And then sometimes they were given an associated sign that they could learn that the shock was going to come, and they could jump before the shock came and just not be shocked at all. And they could learn that. Whereas the ones that were in the learned helplessness group did not, to a very large degree, failed to learn. Like 67, the normal failure rate was 5%. And it went up to 67% with the learned help, with the escape, the yoked group. Now, you asked about the time onset, and that's coming up in a couple of slides. Before I show that one, this is kind of a neat little way that they very precisely varied this variable called uncontrollability. And this is the probability that the response will produce a reinforcement. And in this case, the reinforcement is negative reinforcement, meaning the removal of an undesired thing. So if I jump across and I have the it reinforces the behavior if I jump across, and then the shock is gone. And so the response has a high probability of removing, if the response gives you a different probability of the reinforcer than not responding, then this is called controllable. In other words, it matters if you respond. If you make this response, it matters. It makes a difference. Whereas if it's on this line and the two are exactly equal, you get the same result whether you respond or not. And so that's how they define controllability. Now, with regards to the latency, Sean, I think this is what you were looking for. The top line is the yoke case. This is a median latency, 60 seconds is just how long they waited for them on that trial to get it. The yokes just, I think these are just individual animals that they maybe cherry pick for this, but this is the typical picture. That the escape and the naive pretty much learn it in the same way. After about 3 or 4 trials, they've got it, and 10 seconds. That's actually kind of long, but anyway, it gets down to where they quickly escape, whereas the top ones never escape. Now that's the only info I have regarding the time scale. Does it address the?
Okay, so this is when they've already been exposed to that traumatic event and they've learned helplessness already. Is that correct?
Yes, that's where they got the terminology. They actually have later changed it because they're saying that they don't detect the uncontrollability, they detect controllability, and that turns off the default thing. That's what they've learned from the brain. But from our perspective, I don't think it matters a lot.
Yeah, the thing I wasn't sure about is that I wasn't sure if this was preceded by one really bad day for the animal, or if for the course of 6 weeks they went through the process of conditioning the animal so that it would get this.
They did it with different ways. They would have one training episode with the exposure,
okay,
or they would have multiple training episodes.
Okay,
and
so
they've done very many studies.
And the one training episode. Okay, so from the PTSD standpoint, would you have cases of both? Then you'd have some individuals that after one really traumatic event like the Car of 13, they've learned, and other times where it would take the course of 6 months or something.
These studies don't project onto that, and I kind of want to go offline with this because we're running out of time, and I just want to kind of wrap up.
Okay.
This is an interesting line of conversation, but I'd just rather take it offline.
Yep.
Okay, because real quickly I want to talk about the effects. I'm almost to my last slide. The effects of learned helplessness. It's the perception of control. They did experiments to separately manipulate perception of control versus actual control, and thinking that you have no control is what causes this effect. There's a reduced motivation to respond, meaning that the dogs that were in the example of the shuttle box, when they're getting shocked, they would just sit there and whine. They wouldn't move around. But and then there's some generalization of this motivation effect, meaning that in certain contexts where you learn helplessness in one situation, there's a slightly different context where you show the helplessness. But if you change the context enough, it's not it doesn't generalize to any context necessarily. And so there's questions, an open research question about how that generalization occurs and what the limits are. Now, in addition to the motivational effect, there's a learning deficit, because the dogs that have learned the helplessness, they may walk across the barrier and terminate the shock, but they don't recognize that response as being associated with the termination of the shock.
I mean, the next time they may not do it.
Yeah, they don't learn it.
Yeah.
They don't learn that was a successful behavior. So it doesn't change their perception of what the control is, So they develop kind of a learning deficit as well as this motivational deficit. And so then there's also these there's long-term emotional consequences, which I think are intriguing in light of the connection that's being made to the PTSD. Vanderkolk makes that connection. I think you were kind of intuitively making it a moment ago, and I want to hear more about that. This is the last slide, and I'm just going to put them all up here. So we talked about mental states. I think there's an attractor model of different typical patterns for broadcast trajectories. My idea is that the waking consciousness is one attractor, and then REM sleep is another attractor. Normal unstressed state is one attractor, and then the stress response is another attractor. And so I'm kind of working towards a kind of attractor dynamic model for the idea of linear state. This link between the physiological and the mental states, I think, is very interesting, and then workspace dynamics, how they're different in different mental states, and then the way attention and the way in consciousness, things that come to consciousness, how that happens at the workspace level, and how that affects a different memory formation. And then lastly, I think the learned helplessness is simple enough that it might be possible to build computational models in LIDA of that. I mean, at this point, the PTSD thing is useful for conceptual discussion and exploration, but it's too complex for writing code. And that's all I've got for today. Thank you. It is 5:35. How quickly do we want to shut it down?
It's up to people. People can leave when they're ready and ask questions otherwise, or discuss, or whatever.
Let's get talking about what you were discussing, like this idea of whether you're exposed to one single trauma. Am I touching on that idea correctly?
Right.
Or
Yeah,
is it multiple prolonged exposures to multiple trauma, if you will?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. So you were talking about these flashbulb kind of memories where those things correspond to like this acute onset of some pathological condition like PTSD, right? But it seems like you could also have something that has a longer time course, that's sort of a chronic buildup of something that eventually becomes pathological in some way.
So that's called complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah. Okay.
So there is an actual idea. So if, for example, if you're a torture victim who's a prisoner of war from back in Vietnam, you would have something we would consider complex PTSD, which makes more sense in the context of this idea of learned helplessness. Right. There's really no way for me to get out, and all I can do is just sit here and...
Actually, complex PTSD is not in the DSM.
No, it's not. You're right.
But it is recognized among clinicians who study PTSD. And in fact, there's a chapter, an appendix in this book on developmental trauma disorder, which is a category which is, I think, would pretty much would be very similar to, if not equivalent to, complex PTSD. And Van der Kolk was the leader of a task team that lobbied to get it in the DSM-5 unsuccessfully, and he's rather bitter about that. He expresses it in a restrained way here, but if you watch some YouTube videos, he uses the F word and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it seems like there's something interesting there from just a modeling standpoint, because in the case where you have that memory as a trigger, that's one thing, and that's sort of inducing this alternate state that you're talking about. But there's something else. If you're doing this over a course of like 6 months and slowly building this pathological state up, it may not be a single discrete memory that's triggering this altered state. It might be something else is going on. You might have either generalized something that's causing this issue, or it might be something else that's going on that's just going wacky. The trigger is interesting in that particular aspect.
Smoke detector signal hypothesis. You touched on this concept of the smoke detector, but there was a paper I remember reading for my comp exam where it discusses this idea of a faulty smoke detector.
Are you psychology? Is that your home department? Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do neuroscience and psychology,
Okay.
just kind of, then I do bioinformatics as well, but yeah. So like the smoke detector signal hypothesis is that you have this faulty smoke detector in regards to your amygdala, where the caloric investment, if you will, from an evolutionary psychology standpoint, is much more so than what you would need. So, for example, you brought up the idea of the snake, right? Well, I really don't need to spend an extra, X amount of calories for a branch sitting in the middle of the road. But for some reason, either due to this inherent reptilian response, I guess you could say, I'm going to jump anyways because that's better than being bit by a poisonous snake.
Well, if you think about the context in which it evolved, that evolved, a few thousand years ago, you're probably a lot less likely to have a deadly snake than you would be walking the woods today.
Right.
But you still got the same evolutionary biology. You haven't had time to evolve a different balance there.
And the thing about prejudice as well, so if we're looking at this idea from PTSD, so an individual who was in a car crash, right, could easily start to generalize and avoid, if you will, almost driving a car, being around a car, or even the smell of gasoline becomes a trigger. But it's not necessarily the thing that happened. There was no gasoline in the area, if you will, but the fact that it's associated, if you will, to the car.
Another interesting thing that I think related to what you and Mazen are talking about is a paper, I think it's Simon and Schachter, from the 50s about, there's an experiment where they gave various experimental subjects an adrenaline injection. And to some of them they lied and said it was just a saline injection, or some of them they gave a saline injection, but they had different stories they told. And some they told the truth to, but others they just said, this is something that will improve your concentration or something, and then you do a task. And then so when they start to have the reaction, that they had different contexts. Sometimes they have them just talk to a person, and the person who was a Confederate, laboratory Confederate, would tell them a story and would react angrily or whatever. They had the various contexts, and then they asked the person, to explain their physiological reaction. And a lot of times they would take cues from the emotional context and create an explanation for why they were having that physiological reaction. And it was very interesting, but I think the connection here is that's what I mentioned earlier in the talk, that just having your blood pressure go up because you ate a certain food or something
Changes your cognitive state. Yeah.
Yes, and it could trigger,
Sure.
could or at least be part of a trigger for something even without a memory, or something that normally wouldn't trigger it ends up triggering it because of that.
Okay.
So I don't know how that may interact. I don't know if that's really kind of a separate thing than the smoke detector, faulty smoke detector idea.
For example, there are certain depending on certain individuals I've seen anecdotally. I've seen this. I'm not pressing clinician in any way, but just from people I know who've been through some sort of trauma. I remember, getting a call. This was like maybe 5 months back, and what triggered it was just a song, not the lyrics, just the harmony of it for some reason, and it just popped in. So could there be
odors are very strong.
Odors, sounds, and I would wonder if in regards to this concept of the trigger itself, and I don't know how it connected to the LIDA model, and hopefully I'm not going off on a tangent here, hopefully still connected to what you're saying, something that would induce a physiological response, right, would end up kind of bringing up that whole idea of the feeling itself.
Yeah, that's where I was getting at with that pathway through the physiology.
Mm-hmm. And I think another good experiment that was done, just to kind of put it in with everything, is the tightrope and the attractive woman the woman at the end of the tightrope.
Yes.
Remember this one?
I think so.
So like there's this confusion between, am I just excited? Am I just terrified of this tightrope, or am I actually excited of this woman? And they just found this overlap between the two responses, if you will, just due to one.
The attribution.
The attribution, yes.
Yeah,
False attribution.
yeah. That's very related to the Simon and Schachter one, I think.